Hello and welcome to Crek and Fold. Today I'm going to talk about the differences between the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, the two key sources I suggest you use if you want to find out more about the Old Norse and the old ways and the old gods. So let's jump straight into it, and that is that why are there different versions of each book? Why are there so many translations? And that is all down to the value of paper. And what I mean by that is that these documents, these original manuscripts, were written by Christian monks in Iceland in the 12th and 13th century. And access to paper, manuscript paper, was really difficult, and it was very valuable, so you had to make the most of what you had. And so when writing these old Norse stories, these old Norse poems, they went to great extents to really make the most of the paper. And so they wrote often without punctuation, without spacing, and often without letters. And by that I mean they actually wrote words and sometimes just put the first letter of the word rather than the whole word, or the first and last letter of the word, just to save space. And therefore when we come to translate these manuscripts in the modern day, we have to try and work out what these words can mean, and there's sometimes disagreement between what they mean. And then on top of that, there's also sometimes differences in opinion on what words meant or phrases meant, and that is why translations are different. But then to add further mix to this, different times where people lived in terms of the translators meant that the process of writing English changed. So translators of the early 20th century tended to write in an old style of English, which was great for capturing the essence and flavour of the poems, for example, but wasn't so good for modern day readers who are reading it, because you sort of have to translate what was you trying to say using that old English wording, where if you read a modern version of the Poetic Edda, you would find if it's written in contemporary English, you don't have to go through that mental process of trying to work out what's said, but you may lose some of the flavour and aggressiveness of the writing, because some translators in the modern day calm that down because that is the nature of the world at the moment. So understanding why there are differences in the manuscripts because of those translation issues, which book should you buy and why? Well, the Poetic Edda is a book of poems, and the Prose Edda is a description by a monk called Snorri Sturluson about some of the poems and about other myths that aren't included in the Poetic Edda. So on first glance you think, the Prose Edda, that's probably more valuable for me. And to be honest, it may well tell you more information than the Poetic Edda. However, because the Poetic Edda contains poems, and poems have known structures and shapes around them, i.e. we understand the meters involved to create a poem, we can then look at the Viking poetry and see if that meter is broken. Because if the poems don't make poetic sense, we know that they've been altered and maybe are forgeries or false, or have been rewritten. And so because of that, and because of the work we do in the translation, we can actually see that many of these poems are close to source, and therefore we can have great confidence that the writings within the Poetic Edda are as close to source as they can be, and therefore is probably the most accurate representation we have of the old Norse ways. You see, the Prose Edda, although written by a Christian monk, you'd like to think it was an honest translation or an honest representation, because there is no way we can understand whether the writings of Snorri have been altered to reflect his Christian bias. We can't actually tell whether some of the things said are accurate. And so, for example, Snorri refers to Odin as the All-Father many times, which could be analogous to him trying to get the message across that there is a character such as Jesus or God, trying to reflect that, where in the Poetic Edda the All-Father is only potentially mentioned once. We could talk about that particular subject a lot more in a different video, but there are other differences too, such as the Prose Edda talks about Odin and his brothers William V being the creators of man and woman, but the Poetic Edda talks about Odin with Honir and Luthor as the creators of man and woman. And that poem, we can tell because of how it's written and the language used, is a lot older than the Prose Edda. So we know that that was the original story. So we have these differences to bear in mind. So whilst the Prose Edda is a very good book with lots of information in, it comes as a secondary source compared to the Poetic Edda. Now, because both sources work really well together, you have to ask, how would I read them? What's the best way to understand them, and which one should I use? So there are old versions of the Poetic Edda, and these tend to be the most popular ones, the ones by Bellows, and they're quite cheap, a few pounds each. But these have the issue that they're over, well, translation is probably almost 100 years old now, and the fact that they use, to say, this archaic form of English, while they're useful to look at for a study guide for you to help you understand the poems, that probably wouldn't be my first choice. Instead, I'd recommend one of these two, or both if you can afford them, Jackson Crawford's Poetic Edda or Caroline Larrington's Poetic Edda. Now, there are pros and cons to each. Professor Larrington's version has a lot more reference and context and descriptions around how the translations work and the kennings, and it's far more of an academic work. But the English used is closer to the archaic form of English than contemporary. On the other hand, Professor Crawford's work is far more contemporary English, far lighter on the aggressive nature of some of the words. So from that point of view works, but doesn't go into the academic detail about how he's translated certain things in detail. Also, if you buy Jackson's book, make sure you buy a paperback of at least the second revision print, preferably the third, or you can get them both on Kindles. The reason for that being is there are a few print errors in the first edition, certainly the hardback edition of the Poetic Edda. So if you wanted a good version, make sure you get a second or third edition, and if you can afford it, get both or all of them, as many as you can get, because then that allows you to understand different translations, and you can start to work out why people have translated those texts differently. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah. However, to read the Poetic Edda as a whole in one go is a challenge. It's not impossible, but if you don't read much and you want the light touch, you probably want to read a poem at a time. And if you read one poem, it may feel out of context, even though Larrington and Crawford do put text at the start of the poems to give you that context. You may not understand it all. I mean, there's a whole lot going on, for example, in the creation of the Norse world that the Völuspá doesn't mention, but is mentioned in the Prose Edda. So how do you sort of combat that? And that is, if you want to read a poem at a time or a few verses at a time, and then try and find out if it is referenced in the Prose Edda, and then read about it there and then go back to the poem, that is also a good way of trying to understand and make sense of the poems and the myths and the legends and the stories and the gods. In terms of Prose Edda, the de facto version to go to, most people say, is the Everyman's translation, which is by Anthony Fawkes. There hasn't been a highly recommended modern translation. Well, there isn't one out there. I know Professor Crawford's got that on his timetable. That's probably 2 years away, I'd say, at best, maybe even 3 or 4. I'm looking forward to that. But until then, the Everyman's version of the Prose Edda is very good. Again, I think it's available on Kindle. Worth getting, certainly if you like research, because sometimes you can use Kindle on your computers if you've got one, and it's a good way to search for things and write notes and to understand how things go. There are other versions of the Poetic Edda. You get nice pretty versions like this, which may not seem as thick. And, they're okay, such as other versions of the Poetic Edda are okay. But if you want a good translation, the Everyman's version is there for you. So I hope that explains the difference between the Poetic Edda, full of poems and a primary source, and we understand that because they are poems and we know their structure, and therefore we know many of them haven't been changed, versus the Prose Edda, which has a lot, probably quite a lot more information in, but you have to bear in mind it may not be completely accurate, but well worth a read to put some of the poems in context and with other information as well. I've given you recommendations of the versions of the books as well. Everyman Prose Edda, Call for the Larringtons Poetic Edda. So I hope that clears up any confusion some of you may have had about which one to read and why. Any questions, please put them in the YouTube comments or message me on Facebook. I have restrictions on me at Facebook at the moment to post things for reasons unbeknown to me. Mark Zuckerberg has obviously doesn't like me at the moment, so there won't be too many posts on Facebook, so message me there if you don't want to do that on YouTube, and I'll answer any questions as I can, like I always do. So I hope that was useful. Until the next video, please stay safe and stay well, and this was Crackenvold.